My apology. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We apologize that the webinar bombed out last week. We did not understand what had happened until 3 days later when YouTube sent us an email saying that suspended our account. This shows we are working against very powerful institutions and we're rattling the cage. So thank you so much for joining us. Around the world, as you've heard, this issue is debated and it is highly polarized and emotional. Just like euthanasia or abortion, prostitution is often referred to as a wedge issue that divides society and political parties. So even within the ANC, you'll find there are people who stand for one position and others who stand for the other position. Similarly, the DA, the EFF and other parties are divided on this issue. Embrace Dignity is calling on all political parties to unite around the abolition of the system of prostitution that perpetuates patriarchy, undermines gender equality, and is inherently harmful. We are asking you to join us in taking up the plight of the prostituted women, men, trans women, and children, and join the abolitionist movement. So in looking at this issue, we look at the lived experiences of harm, which are real, and the dangers clear and present. And here I'm quoting Marcel van der Vaart because we agree with him. Marcel van der Vaart is an expert in combating organized crime, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. And he said, and I quote him, "Their lived experience of harm are real and the dangers clear and present. Stigmatization marginalizes this community while our criminal justice system fails them dismally. Yet the decriminalization of prostitution and the further commodification of our women and children is not the answer," unquote. So Embrace Dignity is a women's rights organization which was established in 2010. Embrace Dignity seeks to challenge gendered power inequalities that continue to oppress women and girls and marginalize people through the system of prostitution, sexual exploitation, abuse, and patriarchy. People have asked me why I am doing this work. They see me as a middle-class woman who's privileged, and they're asking themselves, why am I doing this work? Why am I stopping people who are exercising choice? Thinking about it, I grew up poor and mostly barefoot. And were it not for my mother, a teacher by profession, and we thank all mothers, I would perhaps myself have been, I might even have found myself in the same situation as Griselda, which you had this afternoon. So it could be anyone. It could be your sister, it could be your daughter, it could be your cousin. So Embrace Dignity is campaigning for the enactment of the abolitionist equality model so that people can make real and informed choices. This model, as you've heard, is based on 5 principles. It's the decriminalization of the prostituted persons. It's the protection, support, and exit options for all prostituted persons. And I want to stress that these programs supporting people to exit completely from the system of prostitution require to be comprehensive, including attention to mental health, because there are scars that you may not see which are deep, which need to be addressed. And we know this from interacting with people who have survived the system of prostitution. The third principle is that there should be no impunity for traffickers, for pimps, and sex buyers. Those are the exploiters. The fourth principle is criminalization of the purchase of all sexual acts. Because as you've heard, this is what creates the demand. And without demand, there would be no supply. And I liked what Jonathan said, that with the law in France, we can now see the sex buyers. Because if you look at our own situation here in South Africa, when people talk about prostitution, they imagine a girl in a short skirt, but they don't think of a man wearing a tie in a smart car. So the last principle, and this is very important, is the training for professionals, as well as putting in preventative measures and education for young people to prevent entry. It's particularly important to train professionals because, as you know, a lot of women complain about how the police treat them and how health workers discriminate against them. So the training is important to say that these rights, the right to health, the right to safety, cannot be denied a person because she's been marginalized by our own systems. So the equality model is a creative third way. You know, often when people think about prostitution, they think there's only either criminalization, total criminalization, or there's decriminalization or full decriminalization. The equality model or partial decriminalization is not a compromise, but a creative third way of addressing the issue of adult prostitution by focusing on the demand and taking us beyond the present impasse of either total criminalization or full decriminalization. As you've heard from Tina and from Jonathan, Sweden pioneered the equality model as part of a comprehensive set of legal and social interventions to combat gender-based violence. And in Sweden, in fact, they particularly speak about men's violence against women. And this is what they were combating, including also combating patriarchy and sex trafficking, and to promote gender equality. As you've heard, the system of prostitution is very intimately linked with patriarchy or male domination. Thirdly, the equality model shifts power, stigma, and accountability and places it on the exploiters where it belongs, the buyers, pimps, brothel keepers, and sex traffickers. And this approach has gained a lot of ground around the world. So if you count the number of countries that have followed since Sweden, it's quickly growing to be close to 10. There's France, which you've heard about, which adopted the model in 2016, Norway, Iceland, Northern Ireland, Canada, Ireland, Israel, and some states in the US, including the District of Manhattan, where Tina comes from. We do hope and are campaigning for South Africa to be the next country to adopt the equality model law, and we have the opportunity to do so and be the first country in Africa. So Embrace Dignity works with partners. We could not do this alone. I know when you go to Parliament, they ask you, so who's with you? Who's behind you in what you're calling for? And of particular importance among the partners that Embrace Dignity works with are survivor-led organizations led by people who have come out of the system of prostitution and who are now standing tall and are reclaiming their place in society. Some of them are studying at university as we speak. Miki Meji, one of them. You saw Griselda has written a book and she's become a much sought after speaker. We also have in the audience with you, Hilda Nompi Klo, who is among those survivors that we are very proud of, who can show in fact that exit is possible. These women inform our position and we are very grateful to them. Another network that we work with is Space International, which is a global network of survivors. As you've heard, we are part of CAP International, and we are very proud to represent our country as part of these organizations that are calling for the abolition of the system of prostitution. We also work very closely with CATW International. And we do hope, Taina, that today might be a day when South Africa will be part of an African chapter of CATW International. We're proud that Mali was there in the beginning, and we've just heard from Jonathan about Burkina Faso, and we know there was a conference in Burkina Faso which was organized by CATW International. So we do look forward to an African chapter of CATW. We will be talking to you later about a campaign which we've started to build a coalition of organizations for the abolition of prostitution in Africa. I will share the link afterwards. So Embrace Dignity, as I was saying, believes that the systems of prostitution and sex trafficking are interlinked, as you've heard, and that they are driven by the oppressive system of patriarchy, targeting the most vulnerable in society. We have a program at CAP International called The Last Girl, and this is very important research because it actually shows wherever you go, wherever you are in the world, it's the most marginalized women and girls who are prostituted and exploited in the system of prostitution. In view of the enormous harms inherent in the system of prostitution, at Embrace Dignity, we do not accept the system as a safe working industry. We do not believe that prostitution can be considered as work, like Taina said. We think it should rather be seen as institutionalized form of sexual oppression, abuse, and exploitation. And let me address the issue of language, which Taina has in fact done. And I know that when we talk about this issue, there's often the question of why do we call it prostitution? I do want to explain that we use the term system of prostitution rather than sex work to refer to the commercial sex trade, which we regard as a system and part of an oppressive system, which is interlinked with other systems of oppression like racism, class exploitation, and male domination. We do not use the term sex worker or prostitute either. Instead, we use the term prostituted person because something is done to them. We think it is important for society to understand that there is a buyer, and that's the person who in fact prostitutes the other person. Embrace Dignity understands that the systems of prostitution, sex trafficking, and pornography are deeply rooted forms of racial, sexual, and economic exploitation, and inherently a form of violence against women and other marginalized people. It is entrenched by poverty, inequality, and gender violence. In fact, in the Q&A, I saw somebody had asked a question about pornography. Pornography definitely drives the demand. And as we look at prostitution, I'm glad to see that here in South Africa, there are organizations that are focusing on pornography because, in fact, it is driving the demand. A lot of the women tell us that one of their worst fears as they have exited the system of prostitution is that one day they'll see themselves in the pornographic images, some of these images taken without their permission. So let me move quickly to the issue of consent, choice, and agency, because some people have raised this issue with us who have said that this is consensual sex between adults, consenting adults. But consent has to be mutual. Consensual sex is entered into willingly and not coerced by financial reward or other material exchange. And here I want to quote McKinnon, who argues that in prostitution, women have sex with men they would never otherwise have sex with. The money thus acts as a form of force, not as a measure of consent. It acts like physical force does in rape. So money buys consent. And is it choice? Is it choice when you don't have other options available to you? And regarding agency, some people say we are taking away women's agency. But the important thing to think about here is that here it's the man, in fact, who has power, who decides. And what we are doing is taking away agency from the buyer and shifting that back to the woman, who in fact is the one who's being exploited here. So I want now to talk about the South African law reform process, because we believe that this should be the starting point for our government. This is a process that began in 2002, 20 years ago. And now, especially this year, we think we will now make progress in terms of this process of reform, as I said, which began in 2002. But then, as you know, our government reissued the discussion paper in 2009, and a report from the South African Law Reform Commission was published by the former Minister of Justice in 2017. Here, South Africa is acknowledging that there's a role for the law, and the role of the law is to protect society, especially the vulnerable. And I want to note here that when the government commissioned the South African Law Reform Commission to investigate and report on an appropriate legal framework on adult prostitution, it clearly stated that the purpose for this was, one, to review the fragmented legislative framework which currently regulates adult prostitution within the larger framework of all common law sexual offenses. But also importantly, this was to consider the need for law reform and to identify alternative policy and legislative responses that might regulate, prevent, deter, and or reduce prostitution. And this was of particular importance because as South Africans were looking at this, the government had made it very clear that the purpose is to look at reducing or deterring prostitution. So the South African Law Reform Commission looked at 4 legal frameworks, and these 4 are non-criminalization or full decriminalization, regulation, partial criminalization, which is sometimes called partial decriminalization, depending on where you're coming from, and total criminalization. So those are the 4 legal frameworks that the Commission looked at. The Commission contextualizes the issue from a global and South African perspective. So it's looking at how globally this issue, prostitution, is looked at, but it's also looking at the specific context of South Africa. As you all know, South Africa is doing this against the backdrop of complex realities in our country, including socioeconomic marginalization of women, the impact of HIV and AIDS, the high levels of violence against women, poverty, and unemployment. So that's the backdrop against which the South African Law Reform Commission did this work. It's very important to note here that our government rejected total decriminalization. When you look at the report of the South African Law Reform Commission, it has 2 options, and I will come into those options. But total decriminalization is not one of them. After extensive research and public consultations, and having evaluated the 4 legal frameworks, the Commission rejected calls for full decriminalization, stating that under the current South African context, which I've just articulated, of high levels of unemployment, poverty, and violence against women, full decriminalization would expand the sex trade and fuel trafficking and organized crime. In fact, already these are becoming major problems in South Africa, even under the present law. So the report then of the Law Reform Commission came out with two options. One option is partial decriminalization, which we recognize as a starting point. We think it does need some work, but it's a good starting point. And the second option is total criminalization with diversion. Now, I want to evaluate first the option of total criminalization or prohibition. As you know, this has been the law in South Africa since 2007, when the Sexual Offences Act was amended by our parliament. And this was a particular time because then the buying of sex was criminalized. So under our current law, both the selling and buying of sex are criminalized, as well as brothel keeping and pimping. But as you know, it's mostly women that get arrested. So in the way that total criminalization has been implemented, it has added to the marginalization of women because it targets them. And also, total criminalization does not have a coherent strategy to achieve the goals outlined in the South African Law Reform Commission report, which is to reduce or deter prostitution. The law has targeted those selling sex and not their abusers. Men who buy sex, pimps, brothel keepers, continue with impunity. By only offering diversion, prohibition fails to address the underlying factors driving the marginalized into the sex trade, and that is why we say it has not worked. I just want to share with you a slide which shows the impact of the current law. It looks like I'm sharing already. Can we move to the next slide? So if you look at that slide, this is the current law, total criminalization. On the left side in red, that's the demand. The sex buyers are creating the demand, brothel keepers and pimps. And on the right-hand side is the system of sex trafficking, which would fall under supply as well as prostituted people. The supply in that prostitution largely fuels sex trafficking. And as you can see in that picture, because total criminalization does not address the demand, the middle part, which is the sex buyers, is quite large compared, for example, to the supply. And this is quite important for us to do the research here so that we have the numbers. But if you think about it, for every woman who is bought in the prostitution system, there are many buyers. And the law presently does not address this. So what we are proposing, and I want to move to the next slide, I just want to show you the impact. But you've actually already seen the impact in France and in Sweden of what actually happens when you apply the equality model. Can you move to the next slide, please? So there is the same picture we're looking at, but now it's completely changed, because with the intervention of the equality model, which criminalizes the buying of sex, which continues to have the pimps would continue to be criminalized, and brothel keeping would be criminalized. The impact of that, it shrinks the demand and provides an opportunity for prostituted people to exit the system of prostitution and access state resources, and those resources provided for by NGOs. So they are no longer regarded as criminals, and they can go into any police station and get help, as well as go into our clinics and our health system, because we've removed criminality from them and we have shifted it to those exploiting them. And some people ask, so where's the money going to come from for supporting this exit, which we know is costly? But what we are proposing, and France has shown this, that it is possible to build what we are referring to as the Dignified Work Fund. What that means is that the money obtained from the penalties, from sex buyers, as well as the taxes, or taking money away from brothels and pimps, that then creates this fund. As you know, many of these brothels are actually in beautiful buildings. So if the state actually targets those estates, that will provide the funding that we need for providing exit. And in that way, at the same time, deal with the issue of organized crime, because as you know, there's a lot of underworld activities that go together with the system of prostitution. Next slide. So you need to break the cycle. There's a vicious cycle between prostitution and patriarchy, with patriarchy perpetuating prostitution and prostitution entrenching patriarchy. So you need to take a decisive act of breaking the cycle, and that is what the equality law does. Next. Taina referred to our constitution, and I just want to say that she's right. Our constitution in South Africa supports the equality model. And in particular, I want to talk about the right to dignity. The right to human dignity is one of the founding values of the Bill of Rights and the South African Constitution. Dignity is also a standalone right enshrined in the Constitution. The drafters of the Constitution envisioned that the state would adopt a proactive approach to the protection of a person's dignity as the obligation of protection of dignity is created. And in particular, Section 10 of the Bill of Rights states that everyone has inherent dignity and the right to have their dignity respected and protected. So under the equality law, this right, the right to dignity, becomes real. And it's important here that it is stated that the state has to do something about it, because you don't have dignity if the dignity is not protected. So under the equality model and partial decriminalization, which is the other name for it, human dignity is protected by sending out a message that the commodification or objectification of the bodies of prostituted persons is impermissible and thus legally reprehensible. The model protects the inherent human dignity of prostituted persons by ensuring that their rights are protected and that they can report abuse from clients, the police, and healthcare professionals. The model furthermore affirms the prostituted person's value by empowering them to access different career opportunities. As I've mentioned, some of the survivors are at university as we speak. And this is through provision of skills and networks gained and accredited organizations. Partial decriminalization also removes the stigma attached to prostituted persons. And as I said, it shifts it. The other right that I want to talk about is the right to freedom and security of the person. And this is a particularly important right if you think about the restrictions right now under COVID lockdown. And you imagine a situation where you are forced, because your children are hungry, to go out into the street, even though the law is against you leaving your house. So in terms of the equality model, we see the protection of the rights to freedom and security of the person, which is Section 12(1)(c) of the Constitution, which provides that every person has the right to freedom and security of the person, which includes the right to be free from all forms of violence from either public or private sources. The prostitution system, as we said and showed, and we listened to Griselda's story, is violent and harmful. This law, the equality model law, protects the freedom and security of the person. Next. So in conclusion, we expect that the government will move quickly this year on law reform with a consultative workshop, media, with the intention of proposing a draft bill on adult prostitution before the end of this year. We're calling on all of you to join the movement for a prostitution-free Africa by signing the charter which I referred to, which is the Charter for the Abolition of Prostitution in Africa. Please go to our website, www.embracedignity.org.za. You'll find a link to this charter. We're calling for a prostitution-free Africa. We're asking you to be part of the movement. So far, the campaign has received 200 signatures from organizations and individuals, and we're activating these signatories into a coalition, the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution in Africa. I want to leave you with the words of our founding father, Nelson Mandela, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for quoting another African, Thomas Sankara. I hereby leave you with the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, "For every woman and girl violently attacked, we reduce our humanity. For every woman forced into unprotected sex because men demand this, we destroy dignity and pride. Every woman who has to sell her life for sex, we condemn to a lifetime in prison. For every moment we remain silent, we conspire against our women. For every woman infected by HIV, we destroy a generation." Thank you very much for listening.